As you know, I am somewhat of an expert on popular music. I've spent many years exploring the subject from the perspective of a philosopher and a culture critic. But, ever since I started this channel, I made it clear that I will not be talking about contemporary music, because I find nothing in it to talk about. When I talk about current issues, I completely ignore the music of our time, and when I talk about music, I go back in time. I am utterly disinterested in any output that comes from the musicians of today. What I do find interesting nowadays is the YouTube community that evolved around love for the music of the rock and roll period. There is what is known as the vinyl community, people who are collecting vinyl albums and talk about them with great passion and knowledge. And there are also channels of mostly middle-aged men, some of them veterans of the music business, who talk about the period, about the artistry that went into making the music, and the culture that emerged around it. One thing that they all seem to share is the understanding that it's over, that music isn't that great anymore. In today's video, I want to talk specifically to people who care passionately about music and wish to relive those times. I want to give my explanation to how and why it ended, and, in the end, suggest how one should deal with this situation, as a music fan or as a musician. This is actually a reaction video. A few months ago, Beato uploaded a short video titled The Real Reason Why Music is Getting Worse. Beato is a veteran session musician and music producer who in 2015 launched a YouTube channel to discuss music. By now, he has millions of subscribers and is arguably the granddaddy of all those music channels I mentioned. He regularly moans about the state of music nowadays, and in that video, he gave his theory as to why it is getting worse. His argument, basically, is that technology had made music too easy to create and too easy to consume. This saturates the market with products that are lazily made, leading to mediocrity. A while later, Andy Edwards uploaded 2 longer videos in reaction to Beato. Andy is a drummer who worked with Robert Plant, among others, and he has a small, but growing, YouTube channel. He comes at it from a more philosophical perspective, and his worldview, in many ways, is akin to mine. Andy's British sense of humor, and he is someone I recommend you give a try. In the first video, he basically criticizes Rick for applying outdated standards to judge musical quality, and says we should allow for new standards to emerge. But he also admits that music isn't what it used to be, and in the second video he tries to offer solutions for today's musicians to get their music heard, and suggests that they learn to play by the rules of the internet, and become content creators. Both Edwards and Beato make many more points, and I agree with most of them, but I think their videos don't go deep enough. This, is where I come in. What I want to do here is present a comprehensive historical analysis of all the reasons that brought music to this sorry state. And I shall start by stating that although there are multiple reasons, they all add up to one big reason, which is the real reason. And that reason is that we currently live in a timeline in which music doesn't matter. And it comes right after a period in which music mattered the most. What I call the rock and roll period, lasting from 1955 to 2005, was a time when music was central to people's lives more than ever before, even more so than in the heyday of the Romantic period, in the early decades of the 19th century. It was a time when popular music was the vessel of the Western spirit, the thing by which people expressed themselves, found their identity, associated with others, got their views about the world, fought for their rights, formed romantic attachments, and had fun. But in what I call the cyber period, starting in 1995 and still going on, all of this went away. In the transitional phase between the two periods, between the years 1995 and 2005, something happened that changed the place music takes in our society, in our culture, and in our psyche. What happened? Well, several things, actually, and we are going to go over all of them. We shall begin on surface level, and gradually dig deeper to find out why music in the cyber period stopped mattering. Let's start with before the rock and roll period, there was a thing called a singing voice. Singers were judged by the beauty of their voice, how it pleasured the listener. In the rock and roll period, singing was less about pleasuring the ears of others and more about the sensation that the act of singing created in the singer. This was a new way of experiencing music, and the singers of the period kept coming up with new ways of singing, new sensations that kept the music scene exciting and fresh. What brought about this change, and why is it no longer the case? The rock and roll period is part of what I call the pop age, which began in 1915. One of the things that brought it about was the technological innovations that followed the harnessing of electricity. Until then, singers used to sing in a loud voice that could be heard in the back seat. The advent of the microphone allowed for the rise of crooning, singing in a softer voice that allowed for more delicate expression of emotions. Starting in the 1920s, crooning became the dominant style of singing in popular music, but loud voices could still be heard as well. The late 1940s saw the rise of the blues shouters, black American singers who would shout into the microphone, usually expressing an upbeat spirit and the wish to party after the hard times of the 30s and 40s. Then, in 1955, a new generation of young musicians, both black and white, turned this form into a new style of music called rock and roll, and one of the things that distinguished it was that the shouting became screaming. Screaming is an act that creates a strong physical sensation, especially if you do it over an elongated period of time. And, when it was done in the rock and roll way, this sensation was intensely pleasurable. We shall later try to understand why, but for now all we shall say is that it changed the approach towards singing. From here on, popular music would be dominated by different ways of screaming and shouting into the microphone. It turned out that there are many different ways to create an intense pleasurable sensation while screaming, and it all depends on how you use the muscles in your diaphragm, chest, throat, and mouth to put pressure on your voice. The different ways of doing it created different vocal styles, and those different styles were one of the things that distinguished one musical genre from the other.
So good, I got you. Wow, I feel nice.
The sensation was not just in the singer. Being screamed at also creates a sensation, especially if the scream is technologically amplified to the point where you can feel it hitting your body. More importantly, you could take part in the singing, too. Opera singers sometimes scream as well, but it would take you years of training to learn how to scream like that. In rock and roll and what came in its wake, you no longer needed a singing voice, so the audience could scream along and feel the sensation of singing in that way. It did not require a singing voice, but it did require you to dig into yourself to find the repressed parts in you that were released by this kind of screaming. Thus, the music had a liberating effect, in which you discovered your inner powers and set them free. By the early 90s, however, pop music pretty much exhausted all the different ways to create vocals in this way. Heavy metal singers were now digging deep into the nether regions of the darkest human emotions to create the energy needed to sing in voices that sounded barely human. After that, the lemon was truly squeezed dry. There was, however, another way of singing. The hip-hop rappers don't scream, but achieve the intense sensation through the rapid-fire manner in which they spit the lyrics. Here, it is the different flow of the rap which creates the variety of sensations. Hip-hop was born in the 1970s, so it was younger than rock and roll and still had some options. But by 2005, it, too, was done. Since then, I haven't heard any manner of singing, or any rap flow, that didn't sound like something I heard 1,000 times before. With no options left, vocalists stopped trying to find new ways of singing. We actually went back to the singing voice. People enjoy Adele because of the beauty of her voice. I too enjoy her voice, but it doesn't create any new sensations in me. Today's music lost that ability to make us sing in ways that liberate parts in us, and thus it no longer matters. Earlier, I mentioned the technological innovations of the late 19th century as a thing that brought a cultural shift. Mainly, we are talking about recording technology. Before that, new music was released in the form of note sheets, but now it was released in the form of records. Of course, it took decades until recorded sound reached the point where it was good enough to record music. The first piece of recorded music that I find enjoyable to listen to is this 1911 recording of Alexander's Ragtime Band. By 1915, recorded music became an industry, allowing for a completely new musical logic to emerge. This was one of the things that ushered in the pop age. At the time, though, people were more dazzled by recorded visuals, and the main pop medium was the motion pictures, also known as cinema. I call the period between 1915 and 1965 the first period of the pop age, the Hollywood period. The main popular music form of that period, the one that determined its spirit, was jazz music. Jazz musicians regarded every moment as unique, and therefore a song could not be played the same way twice, but every new performance of it had to be different. Hence, they were vehemently opposed to any studio manipulation of the performance after it was recorded, like overdubs. They considered it cheating, and this attitude dominated the pop world. Studio manipulations were reserved for novelty records. But then, in the early 50s, came a couple of novelty records that changed everything. In 1951, Les Paul and Mary Ford released How High the Moon, a huge hit that topped the pop chart for 9 weeks. Les Paul was an inventor, and one of his inventions allowed musicians to simultaneously record several things, even before the invention of multitrack tapes. Here we hear Ford singing all the vocals, harmonizing with herself. It wasn't the first recording that used this gimmick, but there was something about this one that made it more than a gimmick, because Paul also took the opportunity to introduce his other invention, the solid-bodied electric guitar. This was a completely novel sound, and young aspiring musicians listened and took note.
On July the 2nd, 1953.
In 1954, Maverick record producers Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller wrote, arranged, and recorded Riot in Cell Block No. 9 with a band called the Robins. It is a theatrical piece about a riot that breaks in a prison cell block, and all the fun that is had, fun that is dramatized on the record by the addition of sound effects. Soon after, rock and roll became the riot, and in the rock and roll period, the record itself became the art piece. Not a way to faithfully capture a musical performance, as it was in the Hollywood period, but a piece of sound, crafted by artists of sound. Lieber and Stoller led the way, and by the early 1960s, their apprentice Phil Spector was already doing wonders in the studio, creating soundscapes that blew the listeners' minds. The 60s were an intense period of experimentation with sound, as rock and roll musicians, producers and technicians were constantly trying to outdo each other in producing sounds no one has ever heard before, and finding ways to weave them into the music. When psychedelia came along, in the second half of the decade, listeners were demanding sounds that resonated in their acid-drenched minds, and pop music was there to provide them. The upshot was that inventors started to come up with new devices to create and manipulate sounds. Synthesizers, sound effect boards, samplers, sequencers, and other gadgets came into use, presenting a plethora of artificially manufactured sounds, which took decades for musicians to explore. In the late 80s, it brought back the psychedelic attitude in the form of rave music. It was electronic dance music, not acid rock, but the spirit was similar. Dancing with abandon to music that set your body to rhythm and drenched your mind with alien and weird sounds. Eventually, though, this lemon was also squeezed dry. The dubstep music of the early 2000s is the last time I remember hearing music that sounded foreign to my ears, something completely exciting and fresh. After 2005, it all felt like regurgitated sounds. There were still some things going on. Since rave music never really took America in the 80s, it still sounded new to many listeners, leading to a comeback of rave in the late 2000s, and then the mainstream takeover of dubstep in the early 2010s. Heavy metal was also a sound that the mainstream only adopted in the late 2000s. Plus, the auto-tune device, that was only introduced in 1997, allowed YouTubers to songify found videos of people talking. So there was still some excitement in music at that time, but that, too, played itself out by the mid-2010s. There's nothing new to do with all those sound devices, and when something becomes mundane, it just leads to laziness. This is the reason for the negative effect that Rick Beato speaks of. Musicians no longer regard sound devices as an instrument to explore, so they just treat them as a convenient way to edit music, inevitably leading to uniformity. Music lost its ability to trigger our pleasure spots with new sounds, and thus, it no longer matters. Let's start digging deeper. We talked about the vocals, and we talked about the sound, how they are unique to every pop music style. We can add that every style has its own unique rhythm, and its unique body movement. They all come together to create one thing, and that is the unique experience of that style. The thing that gives the styles of the rock and roll period their power is that at the basis of each of them there is an ecstatic experience, which makes the fans feel like it is taking over their body and their mind, and makes them transcend their daily existence into a higher realm whenever the music is playing. The fans judge the music by its ability to give them that experience. If it does, it is deemed real, and if it doesn't, it is deemed fake. Thus, jazz fans distinguish between real jazz and fake jazz, rock fans distinguish between real rock and fake rock, funk fans distinguish between real funk and fake funk, etc. In the rock and roll period, the experience became the center of the fans' lives, the deepest expression of their spiritual world. The experience is first discovered when musicians find a new mixture of rhythm, sound, vocal delivery, and body movement to create the perfect elixir that causes ecstasy. And because the pop age has recording technology, this experience can then be stamped into the grooves of a record and experienced by others. Other musicians then recreate the experience, and a new pop style is born. At first, it sounds like it came from another world, with a musical logic that is completely alien to anything that came before. But for some people, especially young kids, it makes sense more than anything they've heard before, and they become devoted to it. It turned out that people from all over the world can all feel the same experience due to some shared background and traits that they have, and they come together around the style to form a community. Other people, and that's the vast majority of people, don't feel the experience, and the new style initially sounds like senseless noise to them. Every new pop style, at first, encountered hostility. But the experience, as we shall later discuss, also liberated something that needed to be liberated, and in time, the musical style mixed with mainstream forms of music. Its logic became less alien, and more people began to understand and internalize it. Thus, these musical styles changed Western culture. The This created a whole new musical language. What classical music called musical language, and what the academies still teach as musical language, had to do with the aspects of music that could be notated on a page, like notes, scales, and keys. Every scale and key have their own meaning in classical music, and the composers would use the interplay between those meanings to tell a story or convey a sensation through the music. In the music of the rock and roll period, it was about the interplay between the experiences. So, for instance, if you used rock instruments, but the experience you created was the funk experience, it would feel like you are using funk to break out of the logic of the rock world. Thus, the language of pop music became the language of social struggle and change, and that's one reason why it matters. Some of you might be wondering, hang on, jazz was around before 1955, and you said that it has its own ecstatic experience. Why, then, are you saying that this whole experience thing typifies the rock and roll period in particular? True, jazz was around at least since 1915, and when we listen to the music that was made back then, we can detect some ecstatic experiences, like the jazz experience, the swing experience, and the bop experience. But in the Hollywood period, pop music was generally not regarded as deep or transcendent, and people didn't talk about it in terms of an experience. There were, as always, some exceptions, some people who were ahead of their time. The hepcats of the 1940s believed that jazz, especially bebop jazz, gives them a different kind of consciousness, one that only the hip could understand, and everyone else was called square. But they were a small group of mostly African Americans and weren't really known to the public. An even smaller group were the handful of writers known as the Beat Generation, who in the late 1940s defined a new experience, the beat experience, and one way to achieve it was listening to bebop. It was only in 1955, when Allen Ginsberg galvanized the San Francisco poet community with his new poem Howl, that they started to gain popularity, and the beatnik subculture emerged and popularized the beat and hip attitudes. Only then did jazz start to be widely regarded as a deep spiritual experience. One testament to this switch is the fact that the lyrics of many rock and roll songs were about rock and roll, about how amazing it is. Same goes for the styles that came later. They had many records about the musical style itself, about how it made them feel, and how it is the greatest feeling ever. This rarely happened before that. In 1932, Duke Ellington wrote, "It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing," showing that there was awareness to how important the experience is, but this was a one-off record. Blues singers, from the 1920s onwards, often sang about having the blues, but they spoke of the blues as a certain bad feeling. After 1955, it was very different. When you listen to blues fanatics of the early 60s, represented by musicians like Eric Burdon and Eric Clapton, you realize that they want to have the blues. The blues was no longer described as merely a feeling, but as a deep spiritual sensation, one that you want to experience. In the case of the blues, the experience is more cathartic than ecstatic, but the important thing here is that it has become a desired experience, one that you wanted to experience again and again, and this is what characterized being a music fan in the rock and roll period. The problem was, it didn't last. After you experienced many records of the style, you started to feel diminishing returns. It wasn't as exciting, wasn't as ecstatic, wasn't as liberating. Furthermore, since the style was gaining more and more popularity and entering the mainstream, other musicians started to emulate it, musicians that didn't have an inner understanding of the style. Thus, they saturated the market with fake versions of it, records that didn't contain the experience. The style would become mundane. Musicians would then dive deeper into the style, purify the elements of it which they perceived to be the real elements, and often, this would result in the birth of a new ecstatic experience, a new style. Bebop, for instance, was born in the early 40s when musicians tried to purify jazz, feeling it had become too commercialized. Then, in the mid-60s, young rock musicians, inspired by the beatniks, tried to use rock instruments to recreate bebop, and the result was acid rock, and the psychedelic experience. In the late 80s, house musicians realized they can produce psychedelic sounds with electronic devices, tried to recreate the psychedelic experience within house, and the result was acid house and the rave experience. Thus, pop music kept providing new transcendent experiences throughout the rock and roll period. Alas, it had to end someday. In the mid-70s, in reaction to rock music becoming too elaborate and moving away from ecstasy, young musicians attempted to recreate the rock and roll experience of the mid-50s, and punk was born. But after 2 decades of rock, it pretty much exhausted itself. While 50s rock and roll was joyous and full of options, punk was angry and nihilistic, with the only positive value it could offer being the punk experience itself. Once the punk experience ceased being transcendent, they had nowhere to go, at least not in the frame of rock music. In the late 80s, Seattle musicians tried to revive the punk experience, and came up with the grunge experience. But grunge already sounded like it was squeezing the very last drops of juice out of a dry lemon. The entire catalogue of Nirvana sounds like trying to dig deep in order to create joyous ecstasy, but always ending up frustrated by the inability to do so. Same happened to the styles that came after punk, that moved away from rock to create music that wasn't guitar driven. They were all done. We finally exhausted all the options of using music to create ecstasy. The grime and dubstep of the early 2000s are the last styles I remember that gave me that ecstatic sensation. After 2005, nothing. The young people of today don't experience music in that way. By now, the logic to understand those musical styles has been internalized in our culture, and they sound as something pretty, not something alien and shocking. Thus, they don't make you feel like you transcend your everyday life when you listen to them. Kids today don't feel the ecstasy, that feeling of being taken over by something powerful that transforms you. Hence, music doesn't matter to them. We mentioned that every pop style had its own unique rhythm, vocals, sound, and body movement, which created its unique ecstatic experience. It didn't end there, though. Once the community coalesced around the music, the members in it started to develop an identity that was built upon the experience, an identity that was manifested in wardrobe, hairstyle, accessories, language, and customs. It usually developed in some city, and then, once the music got on the radio and gained more devotees, and the singers went on television with the look, became a national, and often international, subculture. The subculture was a closed world in which they could experience a communal existence better than the lonely life of the urban world. But they were not disconnected from reality. Every one of these group identities had a certain existential philosophy, a certain attitude towards the world. The identity was not confined to the times when they went to concerts, but they lived it in their everyday life, and it was usually a happy existence, at least for as long as the experience was still pure and transcendent. There was some of this going on in the Hollywood period, but it really became a thing in the rock and roll period. Rock and roll was the music of youth, and it determined that throughout the rock and roll period there would be a youth culture, a culture that existed in constant rebellion against the adult world. Within this youth culture, kids would find the music that excited them, join the subculture around that music, and battle it out with the other subcultures. In Britain, the Teddy Boys arose in the mid-50s, the first working class kids to dress up nicely, and they adopted rock and roll as the music that expressed their identity. In the late 50s, as rock and roll was saturated with fake records, the rockers emerged as a subculture that remained faithful to real rock and roll. In the early 60s, the mods were more sophisticated and individualist kids who came out of the British rhythm and blues scene. In the second half of the decade, the skinheads were mods who adopted a more uniform look and preferred Jamaican music. In America, the beatniks came out of the bebop scene, the surfers out of surf rock, and the hippies out of psychedelia. The hippies, however, didn't just think of themselves as a subculture, but as a counterculture. that aimed to replace mainstream culture. They took over the music scene in the early 70s, erasing the other subcultures, but then came punk that rebelled against the hippies and determined that the ideal existence is in a subculture. It brought back all the old subcultures, as well as generating many new ones, like new romantics, soul boys, goths, etc. So, the early 80s were all about subcultures, and the music press got wise to it. Whenever it seemed like a new scene was emerging, hordes of journalists would go there to be the first to report about a new group identity you might like to check out. This would then immediately be picked up by the fashion industry, that would design clothes for those who wanted to show that they were hip to the new style. By the mid-80s, the style game was more about flash than about substance. It took all the fun out of it, and when the grunge kids came along in the late 80s, they purposefully tried to troll those journalists and fashion designers, and adopted an anti-style look that was the most opposite of cool they could think of. Didn't matter. It swiftly became the new cool look. After that, youth culture gave up and pretty much abandoned the game of identities. In the mid-90s, the World Wide Web became a thing, ushering in the cyber period. On the internet, you don't need a singer to come and introduce you to a new identity that you feel an affinity to. You can simply go online and find others who are like you. Thus, music was no longer the driving force generating new communities and identities. When Justin Bieber became a sensation in 2010, the reaction seemed very similar to the youth sensations of the rock and roll period, except there was nothing new in the music he offered. What was new and exciting about Bieber was that he gained his initial popularity through YouTube. He showed that YouTubers can become superstars, prompting many others to try it, and they realized that you don't even have to be a musician, you just need to be a YouTuber. The streaming stars took the place of the rock stars in our culture, as those who create communities. It used to be that someone's record collection was a big part of their identity. The music you used your limited amount of money to buy was dear to you, and some were quite fanatic about it. Once file sharing became a thing, in the late 90s, anyone could easily consume any music, and people started listening to music from many musical cultures. It broke down the cultural barriers, but the downside is that musical identities are no longer a thing. The internet also killed youth culture. In the rock and roll period, once you reached the age of 30, you were a has-been, no longer connected to the youth-driven culture. Unless you managed to become famous while you were young, you were then doomed to a routine life of work, family, a closed circle of friends, and watching TV. In the cyber period, we are all online, and online you are ageless. You can become famous at any age, you can join new communities and find new friends, and you can be part of what's going on. As a result, culture shifted to more adult-oriented interests, and the sexy, youthful, rhythmic music of the rock and roll period matters less. Another cultural shift it brought is a reversal in the power dynamics between jocks and nerds. In the rock and roll period, with its emphasis on the virility of youth, the jocks, those who prefer outdoor activities, ruled, while the nerds, those who prefer indoor activities, were ridiculed. It was the period of the sexual revolution, of Western culture liberating the body from the repressive shackles put on it by religious traditions. Pop music was the driving force of this liberation, and therefore it mattered. But the internet brought back the focus to non-physical activities, and made nerds the rulers of the cyber period. All the nerd mediums that were so uncool in the rock and roll period, like comic books, video games, and fantasy literature, rose to prominence in the new period. Music now matters only when it provides a soundtrack to other mediums. Here is where it all comes together. I've been talking in general terms about liberation, but I didn't show how it manifested itself in human history. Pop music was the main vessel of the Western spirit in the 20th century, especially during the rock and roll period. As such, It was at the heart of all the social, moral, and philosophical struggles of the time, the engine that drove cultural changes. It doesn't anymore, and therefore, it no longer draws those types of creative people who want to change the world, the type of people who create great art. Here we shall provide a very quick and very partial overview of the history of how this happened. Before we begin, a general observation about art. Every artistic medium goes through 3 stages. The first is what I call the pop stage. This is when it is considered to be no more than lowbrow entertainment for the masses, and therefore has no aesthetic boundaries. It is consumed as entertainment, is part of the daily lives of people, and can earn a pretty penny for those who are good at it. The creators don't take themselves too seriously, but the brilliant ones among them employ the total aesthetic freedom to experiment and blow the public's mind with new innovations. Later, they are remembered as the greatest geniuses of the medium, those who opened up the possibilities that everyone later explored. We shall take classical music as an example. It was created in the 18th century, when composers started to treat music as a medium of expression in itself, not just as accompaniment to singing. They became quite popular, but not perceived as serious artists. The 18th century regarded the world as a manifestation of the perfect divine order, and art was supposed to reflect that order. Painters, for instance, were supposed to paint nature, but also convey the divine order found in that nature. Music was perceived as merely representing human emotions, not as a manifestation of anything divine, and therefore as a medium that can be very moving, but not really art. As composers like Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven were breaking grounds, making great music, and setting new rules, they were regarded as no more than entertainers by their contemporaries. The next stage is what I call the serious stage. This is when a new generation of thinkers come along, who feel that there's something in the medium that is more than entertainment, and this leads them to rebel against the paradigms of their time, and create new ways of thinking, a new logic to understand the art. With classical music, it was part of the breaking down of that 18th century paradigm that regarded the world as a manifestation of the divine order, and the rise of the modern paradigm that regarded the world as incomplete. The modern paradigm rebelled against the notion of paradise in the afterlife, and demanded to create paradise on earth. But it believed that man still has to mature before he can devise the perfect society and live in utopia. The modern age was dedicated to the idea of progress, of man exploring himself and exploring the world, thus gradually becoming more enlightened until we reach full enlightenment. In this paradigm, which was about constant movement, music took an entirely different place. For some, it was seen as expressing this progression, this inner growth. Alternatively, there were those who believed that the world can never become complete, and searched for transcendence to a place beyond this world. They regarded music as a manifestation of the sublime, of that thing that doesn't imitate the world like other art forms, but comes from a place beyond it. Thus, music suddenly became important. In the 1810s, there were already thinkers like E.T.A. Hoffmann and Arthur Schopenhauer who portrayed it as the highest of all art forms, and this perception spread throughout the 19th century. When it is in the serious stage, the medium is still popular with the masses, and thus still regarded by snobbish elites to be a lower form of art, but it already has artists and fans that take it more seriously, as an important art form. This is when the medium achieves its greatest social and cultural power. On the one hand, it expresses the deepest ideas of its time. On the other hand, it is connected to the masses and thus can spread these ideas and affect social change. In the 19th century, classical music was one of the main driving forces of European culture, as it was going through the struggles of the modern age. It was the favored medium of the bourgeoisie, the social class that was fighting to change the social order created by the aristocracy and the clergy, and create the perfect society based on the ideas of enlightenment. What I'm saying is, basically, vox populi, vox dei. If you want to know which contemporary art pieces will be considered as masterpieces in the future, look for them in the pop mediums, those that are popular with the masses and denigrated as vulgar entertainment by the culture guardians. But be careful not to misconstrue this statement. I am not saying that the most popular pieces will be remembered as masterpieces. I am saying that the mediums in which the masterpieces are created are the popular ones. There were composers at the time that were more popular than Mozart and Beethoven, but no one remembers them today. But if you ask people who were the most important artists of that time, classical music composers like Mozart and Beethoven will be somewhere near the top of the list. In the 1970s, the Osmonds sold more records than Led Zeppelin, but history remembers Led Zeppelin as more important. But when you ask who the most important artists of the 70s were, you will look for them in the mediums of popular music, not in theatre, painting, or classical music. And the future will probably regard some contemporary video games to be important artistic masterpieces, but not necessarily the games that are most popular today. This means that in the serious stage, there are two types of fans. Most are casual fans, those who consume the lighter pieces, making them the most popular. And there's a minority of serious fans who consume the deeper pieces. Eventually, the latter get tired of being grouped with the former and seek to isolate themselves. Classical music that in the first half of the 19th century was played in public gatherings, pubs, and other hangouts of the masses started to close itself up in concert halls and opera houses, designed to escape the masses. When this happens, the popular side and the artistic side begin to drift away from each other, until they lose connection, and they are both worse for it. Eventually, the medium reaches the third and final stage, the high art stage, in which it is no longer consumed by the masses, but by a closed group of snobbish aficionados. The medium then distances itself from anything that is considered vulgar, like sex, violence, action, horror, lowbrow comedy, and latest fashions, and as a result, it loses connection to everyday reality, no longer able to comment on it in a way that touches people. And this is where it remains, forever stuck in its bubble. But that is not the story that the high art people tell themselves. They believe that history will justify them. They point out to the geniuses of the medium how they, too, were not appreciated by their contemporaries until everyone realized they were geniuses. They tell themselves that those denigrating them were the masses. They fail to realize that it was actually people like them, the high art snobs, who were doing the denigrating, while the masses actually loved those geniuses. The myth of the starved artist who is discovered only after death is nothing but a myth. Unless it is someone like Vincent van Gogh, who killed himself before anyone had a chance to see those magnificent paintings, the geniuses of art enjoyed some degree of popularity with the masses of their time, and made money from their trade. Classical music entered the high art stage around 1915, as the modern paradigm was beginning to deteriorate. Within a few decades, it became completely irrelevant, a closed world reliving its glorious past. Classical music fans believe that their music is better than 20th century pop music, that it will win the test of time, not realizing that it is actually just the pop music of previous centuries. They were still stuck in the musical logic created in the modern age, failing to make the switch into the pop age. We, however, are going to make the switch. From here, we move from Europe to America, where the paradigm of the pop age was born, and where pop music took the place of classical music as the deepest expression of the human spirit. What was known as pop music in the Hollywood period was the music created by the American pop industry, known as Tin Pan Alley. Music was written in the traditional European way, in which professional lyricists wrote words, professional composers set them to music, and trained singers performed and recorded them. The compositions followed the rules of classical music, but simplified a great deal and turned into 3-minute songs that did not presume to represent any eternal ideals, but dwelled in everyday life. These were the peak years of Tin Pan Alley, the period when the so-called Great American Songbook was written. Similar music was written in Europe at the time, But what gave America the edge was that the logic of the pop age was already beginning to prevail. While the songwriters of Tin Pan Alley were still thinking along the lines of the musical language of classical music, they were already internalizing a new musical language. This new musical language was mainly the result of the interaction between black and white Americans. When Africans were brought to America as slaves, their owners took steps to erase their African heritage and impose the European culture on them. But residues remained, especially in the approach to music. Europe generally regarded music as an expression of the sublime, something that takes you away from your earthly existence, so it repressed earthly elements like rhythm. In Africa, music is generally more rhythmic and danceable, and the dance is how one connects to their cultural heritage and finds their own identity. Black Americans, even in the years of slavery, took the European music of their white masters and did it their own rhythmic and danceable way. And that way appealed to some young white folks who found greater freedom in it. The story of American pop music is the story of blacks taking elements of white music and mixing them with elements of black culture and music to create a new style. White musicians then emulating it and making the style popular. A new generation of black musicians, feeling that their music has been diluted, then creating a new style out of appropriating elements of white culture. And so forth. Through this process, white consciousness was gradually opened to accept black people and respect their culture, and blacks gradually integrated in American society. The most important style in the Hollywood period was of course jazz. Jazz, at first, was perceived as an expression of the modern world with its high energy, hectic pace, and individualistic spirit. By the 1930s, however, jazz started to set its own rules. Jazz artists saw themselves as capturing and enhancing the moment, as every moment in time is unique. Thus, while the modern-minded people were still thinking about progressing towards the future, pop-minded people were about making the most out of the now. And within that mind frame, ecstatic experiences started to emerge. The jazz experience, brought about by players playing fast and improvising within the agreed confines of a piece, gives the feeling of chaotic bursting at the seams. Jazz employed sounds that were considered lewd, hysterical and grotesque, along with sounds that were considered pretty and sublime, and messed up all the hierarchies. The result is a feeling of mirth running around in your body. For those feeling that the modern world was too boring, it provided an ecstatic way to break out of it. Then again, unlike Europe, America was still enjoying modern progress, and another experience provided a way to find joy while still being part of the big modern machine. The unevenly rhythmic way in which jazz musicians played generated the swing experience, creating a giddy sensation inside your body and setting it in a groovy, side-to-side, finger-popping motion. It turned out that this experience is enhanced by the addition of more musicians, which led to the formation of the big bands. Thus, jazz was put in a more ordered setting, but the main thing is the back-and-forth swing created in every bar. When the musicians really get into it, it makes you feel like you are being pushed higher and higher, and the individual musicians can then soar and improvise on top of it. It was a more ecstatic way to experience the modern interplay between the individual and the collective, and enhance the constant movement forward with the swinging motion. In the early 40s, black jazz musicians felt that jazz has been diluted by the pop industry, so they dove deeper into it and created bebop. While previous jazz musicians still had a melody to work with, on which they were riffing, bebop kept only the chord structure, and the musicians would develop the melody on the spot, each soloist picking up where the previous one left, and developing ideas of their own to then be riffed upon by the next soloist. A bebop performance takes you away from your daily routine into an act of creation that is happening in the present, liberating your mind from preconceived notions into a place where it can move in new patterns. By the early 60s, it led to free jazz, which did away even with the preconceived chord structure, and through which black musicians could develop new ideas, rebelling against the rules of the predominantly white society. Meanwhile, the beatniks perceived bebop as the thing that connects you to true reality, the ever-changing, ever-creating, ever-burning reality that exists under the veneer of society's norms. With these developments, jazz entered its serious stage. Other important musical styles of the Hollywood period included gospel, the music that came from the Black Pentecostal churches, where they took Christian hymns and did them their way. Through call and response and through wild dancing, the singers would drive themselves into ecstasy, feeling that they are losing themselves in a higher power, being consumed by God, at least for a while. Then there was the blues, a black secular music form that dealt with the darker, more melancholy sides of life, and provided catharsis for emotionally going through them. On the white side, there was country, the music of the rural folks, who regarded modern urban life as taking you away from your nature and corrupting your soul, and saw pop music as an expression of this life. Country music provided liberation from this corruption, reconnecting to the land and to genuine human emotions and passions. Finally, there was folk, which was rooted in the songs created by rural communities, both white and black, and regarded itself as the voice of the common folk, against the pop industry that commercializes everything, and against the capitalist system in general. This ideology led to the rise of folk singers who created new songs with a strong socialist message. These musical styles were all considered mere entertainment in the American mind, that still felt culturally inferior to Europe and its classical music. But then came 1955. Rock and roll feels like your soul was trapped in a little bottle all your life, and the music liberates it and allows it to burst out in a scream of glee. This sensation spoke mainly to teenagers, at that age when you break out of the identity foisted on you since birth and begin to express what you feel inside. For the kids, it felt like the greatest thing they ever felt, uplifting them from the stifling conformity of 50s America. Rock and roll fused rhythm and blues and country, two styles that were looked down upon by the sophisticated city folks, with the pop of Tin Pan Alley, making it seem like the entire youth of America is rebelling against the old cultural distinctions. It led to the rise of youth culture, within which many new musical experiences were born. 1955 was also the year that the civil rights movement began, led mainly by black preachers who took their parishes out of the churches into the streets, demanding racial equality. This was driven by gospel music, with songs that used biblical stories as allegories for current social battles. But soon it was usurped by another style. While white musicians were fusing black rhythm and blues with white pop to create rock and roll, black musicians fused rhythm and blues with gospel to create the soul experience. Soul is very similar to rock and roll in that it feels like erupting out of your body, but while rock and roll bursts out of the guts and is an individual thing, soul bursts out of the chest and uses call and response to make it a communal feel. Like gospel, it feels like losing yourself in something bigger, but in soul it is in something earthly, not in God. Since it was initially part of the 50s youth revolution, that bigger thing was usually the things that youngsters are consumed by, mainly sex and love. But, being a fusion of gospel with everyday reality, it was also perfect for songs that were about becoming part of a movement for a better life, and throughout the 60s, soul was the beating heart of the black American culture in its struggle to gain dignity and respect, to get America to realize that blacks, too, are humans with a soul. The civil rights movement was still part of the modern paradigm, fighting for a better future. The folk movement took part in it as well. But then, in 1965, folk fused with rock and roll, and the fight became not for a better tomorrow, but for a better today. This was one of the things that brought down the modern paradigm, ended the modern age. Another reason it ended is that people realized there was something wrong with the idea of man, that universal, perfect being that we were trying to create. It was built in the image of the European man, and was thus biased against other groups. While soul was still about blacks wanting to be regarded the same way as whites, 1965 saw the birth of funk, which liberated the black psyche from its feeling of inferiority. White music regarded melody and harmony as the civilized side of music, and rhythm regarded as the uncivilized side of the music, was repressed. Funk took the instruments of soul and turned them all into percussive instruments, putting rhythm above all. The result is a polyrhythmic style in which the eruption remains locked in the body, creating explosions in it, setting it on an ecstatic, frenzied dance. This was very hard for white ears to comprehend at first, and funk became a place in which blacks explored their African roots and questioned their identity. 65 was also the year in which acid rock was born. It was born out of the attempt to recreate the beat experience, of connecting to the ever-changing reality that lies under the routine of everyday life, by using hallucinogenic drugs. It turned out that electric instruments could be used to create sounds that appealed to a zonked brain, and acid rock musicians would improvise, bebop style, to create what was called the psychedelic experience. The psychedelic moment was short-lived, but it generated a counterculture that wanted life to be more than what the bourgeois society had to offer. This led to the rise of the rock experience, that toned down the explosive eruptions of rock and roll, but kept it on an intense level, which could be sustained longer. While rock and roll was only about the moment of wild outbreak, rock was about what comes after, about creating an individualist identity that lives life on a more intense level than what bourgeois society has to offer. This allowed for more variety and inner changes in the music, and rock soon absorbed blues, folk, country, jazz, classical music, and other styles, turning them into heuristics with which it dealt with the world. From 1966 to the mid-70s, rock offered an alternative existence, and its songwriters dealt with the philosophical and social issues that were brought forth as a result. With this development, pop music, as a whole, entered its serious stage. Unfortunately, in the late 60s, all that fun rebellious spirit was tarnished, as the counterculture was contaminated with radical left-wing ideas that came from the academy, bringing back the defunct modern belief in fighting for utopia. Among other things, it destroyed most of the advancement made on the racial equality front, and by the early 70s, the black community was in a bad way. Soul fell back into the blues, whereas funk escaped into a closed world of ecstatic dance. But some progress was made on the sexual revolution front. 50s rock and roll liberated sex, made it alright to express it, but in a rather juvenile way. In the 70s, the combination of soul and funk led to very sensual music that explored the joys of sexuality. It allowed girls to express and explore their sexuality as well, whereas before they were mainly just objects of conquest. There was another community that benefited from it. In the modern age, with its attempt to perfect man, sex was seen as something that needs to be straightened out, so any kind of so-called deviant sexuality was oppressed. With the death of the modern paradigm, homosexuality was made legal. But the old prejudices lingered on, and gays were still feared and bullied. They found sanctuary in gay discotheques, where they could form their own world. There, the DJs created a new style of disc jockeying, where they no longer just played requests from the crowd, but pre-designed their set, and invented techniques to string records together to create one long dancing experience, a night-long magical journey. By taking existing records and mixing them together, they combined funky rhythms, soulful singing, and psychedelic sounds to concoct a mixture that affirmed the sexy atmosphere, and gave the dancers hope for a better future. This new musical experience was called disco, and by the mid-70s it broke into the mainstream, allowing gays greater freedom of expression. This historical account is far from comprehensive, and does not cover nearly all the musical experiences of the rock and roll period. I am completely ignoring all the musical experiences that came out of Jamaican music and Latin music, for instance. I'm simply trying to give a little glimpse of how and why pop music mattered. With regards to Jamaica, I'll just mention that since local radio refused to play the very subversive reggae music, Jamaican DJs went out on the streets with their sound systems to throw street parties. In the early 70s, this custom was imported to New York by black American DJs, and they naturally played mainly funk records, not reggae. The DJs then noticed that some kids were waiting for the break part of the record, when only the percussion is playing, to jump in and do an acrobatic style of dancing that aptly became known as breakdance. So they developed techniques to play only the break parts, and string them together to allow the breakdancers to keep going. The result was hip-hop that dove even deeper into the funk experience, using parts of records to create effects of percussion and rhythm. Soon, they added MCs to preside over the parties, and those MCs developed a style of singing that was also wholly percussive, known as rap. By the mid-70s, rock took itself very seriously indeed, creating sophisticated and elaborate pieces. But this made it move away from the ecstasy, and the new generation of youth yearned to go back to the elated outbursts of early rock and roll. The result was punk, that returned to the rock and roll formula of 3-minute eruptions. But rock and roll existed in the modern world, believing in man as a being growing towards a better future, and just wanted to rebel for a while still in your youth years, so the rebellion was happy and fun. Punk came into a postmodern world, a world in which there was no future to look forward to, so its rebellion was nihilistic. The punk experience is similar to the rock and roll experience in that it feels like you are bursting out of your guts, but it is different in that it also lashes angrily against the outside world. The experience was achieved mainly by identifying with things that society considered unenlightened, inhuman, vulgar, and filthy, and thus bursting out of the confines of the norm. This allowed greater freedom of expression to girls, who could now start identifying with things that good girls were supposed to shun. But this also meant that it was short-lived. Soon, it lost its shock value, and there was nothing left to identify with that could recreate the experience. But the punk rebellion did shake the pop world, and affected it to go back to the 3-minute record, a mindset that ruled in the 80s. This meant that jazz disconnected from it. In the late 60s, jazz and rock came together in a style called fusion, which gave rock more sophistication and gave jazz the opportunity to explore what could be done with electric instruments. After punk took rock back to its roots, jazz retreated into itself and entered the high art stage. It has been irrelevant since. In the 1980s, pop music reached the height of its commercial success, becoming part of the capitalist extravaganza of that decade. All the many different styles, those we discussed and those we didn't, now express themselves through 3-minute hit records, celebrating individualism, freedom, fun, and ecstasy. Youth from non-democratic countries were deeply affected by it, leading to democratic revolutions all over the world. But in that, these styles lost the ability to pose an alternative to mainstream culture, and some kids were not content with it. One solution was metal, a style that's been around for a while, but became prominent in the 80s. The metal experience is very similar to the rock experience, but it adds power. A metal song often features the singer facing a mighty force and having to dig deep inside to find the inner powers to overcome and ride it to the end of the record. Metal allowed you to enjoy 80s culture on an even higher level of intensity, or deal with its dark sides and overcome them. So, for those who were already in the mindset of the pop age, the 80s were a celebration of individual freedom. But there are always those who fail to make the switch, and for those people who were still thinking along modern lines, the death of the modern age meant the death of man, the death of the idea of man as a universal being that progresses through history and gradually perfecting himself. It also meant the death of the individual, since the liberation of the individual was tied to the idea of the perfection of man. This led to a feeling of dehumanization, already expressed in punk records as well as the punk identity, which celebrated the artificial over the organic, as if individual identity is merely a construct. In the wake of punk, this feeling started to be expressed mainly through the cold sound of electronic music and the machine sounds of industrial music. But salvation came when these musicians connected to the funk experience, realizing that you don't have to progress to find joy in life. A funk record doesn't progress. It repeats itself again and again, forcing you to liberate yourself from the need to progress. and just enjoy the ecstasy of dancing. This merger of funk and electronics led to the rise of techno in the mid-80s, imagining a future in which man and machine come together in an ecstatic dance. It prepared our psyche for the cyber period. Thus, pop music kept on being at the forefront of social change. Not everyone thought it was for the best, though. Right-wing conservatives, naturally, regarded all these changes as social degeneration, and left-wing progressives weren't happy either. With their backwards modern thinking, they believed society should progress towards a better future, and pop's focus on the present was a negative distraction. In the Hollywood period, progressive thinkers were already describing pop music as a meaningless commodity created by the capitalist world to numb the masses and keep them satiated. Inevitably, this way of thinking permeated pop as well, and whenever a new style emerged, fans of the older styles, those that were already in the serious stage, accused it of being just an industry product, destroying good music. This is what jazz fans said about rock and roll in the 50s, and it is what rock fans said about disco in the late 70s, but in the case of disco, it had more serious repercussions, since it was accompanied by a backlash against gays and gay rights. Disco was driven underground again, to the gay discotheques, and there, in the early 80s, DJs distilled exactly the elements of disco that were so hated by rock and funk fans to create the house experience. In the late 80s, as house gave birth to acid house, it broke out of the discotheques, and along with techno, brought about the rave revolution. Rave rebelled against the hyper-individualism of the 80s, going back to the communal feel of the 60s acid tests. This meeting of funky rhythms and electronics led to more musical experiences, resulting in the many tribes of electronic dance music. And it brought back disco and the full acceptance of gay people. Another style that posed an alternative in the 80s was hip-hop, that upgraded from being mere street music in the 70s to actually producing records. But it was still the sound of the black streets, and often of people who were not part of 80s affluenza. In all previous styles, the liberation of your true identity came about by releasing something that was locked inside. But now we were after the death of man, the death of the individual, so identity could no longer be something that you find inside, but something that had to be constructed. Hip-hop constructs an identity by sampling and mixing music of the past, and by words. Rappers use the word flow to construct and deconstruct themselves, and their poetry always moves on several levels, at once rapping about something, commenting on the rap they are rapping, telling us who it is that is rapping, and commenting about their place in the world. The flow allows them to move from one level to the other without missing a beat, maneuvering the confusing game of postmodern identity. It also turned hip-hop into a potent means of black expression, the Black CNN, playing a crucial role in the racial struggles of the late 80s and early 90s. By the mid-90s, partly because hip-hop made black voices heard, racial tensions were eased, and hip-hop, now the leading pop style, became a field for constructive social dialogue. With the pop mainstream becoming funkier, it was easier for rappers and singers to collaborate, and for the next 10 years, the transitional phase to the cyber period, records became dialogues between men and women, blacks and whites. Finally, there was nothing more about black culture that was considered uncivilized by mainstream American culture, and the black identity was fully accepted as part of America. In 1 week in 2004, a precedent was broken, as all top 10 places on the Billboard chart were occupied by black artists. It was also the year that Barack Obama started his meteoric ascension in American politics, which ended in him becoming the first black president, something that, even a decade earlier, seemed like a pipe dream that couldn't happen in 100 years. All the struggles of the rock and roll period were resolved, all the struggles that could be affected by music. Thus ended the rock and roll period, a period in which the pop stars came out of the social struggles, were embroiled in them, often spearheaded them, and thus had to deal with them in their art. Hence, their views and ideas mattered to people. and their art mattered. After 2005, social media took the place of music as the arena of social struggles, and social media influencers took the place of the music stars as cultural icons and agents of change. Pop music, the whole medium, entered its high art stage and became culturally irrelevant. Some, however, still didn't get the memo, even 20 years later. We saw it in the recent US presidential elections, when the Kamala Harris campaign runners thought people still care about the political views of pop stars, like they did in the days of Bob Dylan, Bob Marley, John Lennon, Bruce Springsteen, and Bono. They were, and that sadly goes for most of the American left, completely detached from reality.
This really was an historic, flawlessly run campaign. Queen Latifah never endorses anyone. She came out and endorsed. She had every prominent celebrity voice. She had the Taylor Swift, she had the Swifties, she had the Beehive.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump went on Joe Rogan, someone who actually matters. Which brings us to the final thing we shall talk about. Whenever a medium enters its high art stage, it is taken over by sanctimonious elitists who try to use it to impose their moral code on society. The medium still enjoys the aura it gained in the serious stage, of being a force of social change, so they think they can use it to educate the masses. Of course, all they do is hasten its demise as a culturally relevant force. This is what is currently being done to pop music, and it is the final nail in its coffin. A few years ago, there was a ridiculous story about punk fans shutting down a concert by a band that called itself the Viet Cong for the crime of culturally appropriating a Vietnamese group. Cultural appropriation is the blood in the veins of any healthy culture, but in the opinion of the moronic woke progressives of today, it somehow victimizes the appropriated culture. One wonders how those punk fans would have reacted to Sid Vicious victimizing the poor Nazis by appropriating the swastika. I don't care too much, because pop music is a dead medium anyway, but the other thing that they always do is rewrite the medium's history, make it more politically correct, and sap all the spirit out of it. One of my aims in this channel is to salvage the history that they are trying to erase. In this video, I'm just going to tell you a little story of how rock and roll came to be. Our story begins in the early 50s, when it became apparent that white youth, stifled by 50s conformity, is drawn to the freedom, sexuality and ecstasy of black rhythm and blues. The music industry capitalized on it by promoting white groups specifically created to do cover versions of R&B songs, without giving any credit or royalties to the black artists. The cover versions also removed all the elements that were considered uncivilized, like excessive rhythm, sexuality and wildness. This was still the modern age, in which the point was to progress out of the jungle, and black culture and rhythm was seen as backwards culture, that is still stuck very much in the jungle. It was therefore alarming that white youth, that was supposed to represent the better tomorrow, was listening to this black music, but as long as it was made more civilized, it was tolerable. Some, however, believed black culture had its own beauty. One example were Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, a couple of Jewish kids who formed a songwriting duo. Typically for American Jews at the time, they had a leftist, liberal worldview, and they were enamored by black culture and the struggles of black people. In 1953, they wrote a song titled Hound Dog, which was made into an R&B hit by black singer Big Mama Thornton. Excited by their success, they shared the good news with their leftist buddies, only to be sternly berated for it. Pop music, they were told, is a tool of the capitalist system to satiate the masses, and current black culture is an inauthentic culture that should not be celebrated. Instead, blacks should be made to realize that they are part of the oppressed working class, and they need to adopt socialist values and rise up against the system. Lieber and Stoller realized that their leftist friends do not even see blacks as human beings, but as mere pawns to be played with. So they bid goodbye to this type of left, and went on to a successful songwriting career. Another contemporary hip Jew was Alan Freed, a disc jockey on a Cleveland radio station, who, like Lieber and Stoller, was taken by rhythm and blues and played it for the white kids who tuned in to his show. Not just any rhythm and blues. He preferred the most wild, carnal records, which he termed rock and roll, an R&B euphemism for sex. When he realized that the name is catching on, he teamed up with a Jewish entrepreneur named Maurice Levy in order to promote it. A veteran of the music business since the early days of Broadway and jazz, Levy wasn't just a promoter, he was a gangster, of the type that became wheelers and dealers on the jazz scene ever since Prohibition. Levy regarded rock and roll as just another trend, and promoted it in the same way he promoted previous trends. Send a couple of guys to every place that had a jukebox, and tell the owner, "Hey, I got a few records here I want you to play. I heard kids today really like these records, and if they don't find them on your jukebox, they might trash up the place. Nice diner you got here. Be ashamed if something bad happened to it." Thus, the trend was spread, until in 1955, it suddenly took hold like wildfire. By the time Freed and Levy got around to try to copyright the term rock and roll, it was too widespread to copyright. As kids all over America were taken over by the rock and roll experience, they sought real rock and roll records, so those white cover bands were blown out of the water. This was shocking and distressing to American culture guardians. The youth was supposed to represent a society of tomorrow, the more advanced and enlightened world, and here they were, going wild to this jungle music. The music industry soon recovered, however, and started to promote teen idols who created teen-oriented records that sounded like rock and roll, but weren't as wild. By the late 50s, it seemed that the rock and roll beast was tamed. This gave it greater acceptance in American society, that no longer felt threatened by it, and saw it as mere youth music. Then again, it also allowed the youth to create their own culture, to build upon what they discovered about themselves through rock and roll, and make it more sophisticated. And if you wanted sophistication, Lieber and Stoller led the way. The duo signed a groundbreaking contract with their record company, which gave them production control over their records. They would write clever songs about teen life, have young artists record them, and use studio technology to turn the record into a novel piece of sound. By the early 60s, producers took over rock and roll, making it very smart. This opened up new possibilities, but took much of the ecstasy out of it. Meanwhile, in Britain, teens were also completely taken over by rock and roll, and many of them dreamt of becoming teen idols themselves. And this meant they could be exploited. Not by the music industry, but by another group. Homosexuality was still illegal, and it didn't seem like it was going to change. Left-wing progressives were definitely not going to do anything to change it. They regarded homosexuality as a mark of upper-class decadence. Gays, therefore, had to find sneaky ways to get sex, and rock and roll gave them an opening. With their sense of fashion, some of them found aspiring teens and offered them a deal. "I will turn you into a teen idol, but there are a few things I want you to do for me in return." The British rock and roll scene of the late 50s and early 60s was mainly that. Gay impresarios who groomed teens for stardom, and other things. Up north, however, things were different. Kids who grew up in the Merseyside cities of Liverpool and Manchester could not dream of stardom. To be on television or radio, you were required to have an upper-class accent and diction, and with their thick northern accents, they didn't stand a chance. Rock and roll, for them, was a way of life, not a path to stardom, and many kids along the Mersey remained true to real rock and roll, and formed bands to play it in local clubs. One day, a Liverpool kid entered the local record store and asked if they had records by the Beatles, the best band in the city. This piqued the interest of the store owner, Brian Epstein, so he attended one of their performances. After the show, he approached the group and offered to become their manager. What did Epstein see in the Beatles? Well, as a gay man, he probably had the same interests as other gay managers, and to this day the nature of his relationship with John Lennon isn't clear. but he also saw potential in them, a certain magic in their ecstatic music, and he believed that if he just made them look more presentable, he might be able to make some money. The Beatles, who were very young lads, weren't sure about the offer, so they went and asked their parents, what parents they had, that is. Between them, the four Beatles had only 4 parents left at this point, just a reminder of the kind of reality they grew up in. Anyway, when their parents heard the offer, they were like, what? Someone named Epstein thinks he can make money with you? And so, thanks to the Jewish stereotype, they gave their blessing, and Beatlemania soon ensued, bringing back true rock and roll, this time so big that it could not be stopped. The rest is history. Okay, so the rest is history, but why isn't this history? Why is it that any parts in the story I just relayed are so rarely mentioned when the history of rock and roll is told? Well, have you noticed how filthy this story is? How politically incorrect? Those who told the history of rock and roll were usually embarrassed about that stuff, and rarely mentioned it. But what was the upshot of all of this? Because of all those Jewish men in the story, the image of Jews changed and became a lot cooler and more acceptable in Western society. Blacks, thanks to rock and roll, found new ways of expression, and their rhythmic music, that previously was rejected as animalistic, was now acceptable. As a result, they were no longer regarded as backwards people who came from the jungle, but as part of civilized society. Gays continued to be players on the pop scene and achieved greater and greater acceptance as a result. The working class was now able to be heard on radio and television and promote its own culture and values, and the youth now had its own culture and could create values of its own. This is how social change is achieved, by forces fighting to burst through into the light, often using unenlightened means to achieve it. There is no other way to make society better. Of course, progressives will disagree. They think change happens when they manage to educate the masses and spread their values to them. In fact, their values are always behind the times and are a hindrance to positive change. None of the changes I just mentioned would have happened if they had their way. It's only at the end of the road, when the battles have already been won, that they jump on the wagon. It was only in the 90s that they finally realized that the working class revolution is not where it's at, and all the social changes since the 50s had to do with different minority identities fighting for equality. And so they jumped on that wagon, and created the idiotic identity politics of today. Alas, once a medium becomes high art, they take over it, and start to rewrite its history. Now they are trying to convince us that they were always the force behind the identity battles, and pop culture simply absorbed their values. The antidote to that would be to tell the entire history, and not hide the embarrassing parts. This is what I try to do in my different series on the history of music. Which brings us to the question of what music lovers, and musicians, should do now, after we realize that pop is dead. Well, if you are a musician, the first thing you must do is accept this reality. No matter how good your records are, you're not going to matter, and you're not going to have the same level of fame and cultural impact as the heroes of the past. You're not going to be Jim Morrison. You're not going to be Stevie Wonder. You're not going to be Ozzy Osbourne. You're not going to be Madonna. You're not even going to be Midge Ure. It's not anything that has to do with you. This is the state of the medium. Until another paradigm shift happens and music starts mattering again, this is how it's going to be. So, what can you do? Well, look at what happened to classical music. It became a closed world, yes, but it still thrives within that world. It is a community of people who are passionate about the music and appreciate good musicians. The same will surely happen to all the different styles of pop music. They will have their passionate community, and you can enjoy an enthusiastic crowd that actually understands and appreciates the music you make. You will not be a star, but you can make a living doing what you love. The other thing that happened to classical musicians in the 20th century is that they found work writing soundtrack to films. In the Hollywood period, they were ashamed of it, and usually told themselves that they just do it to earn a living, while they write serious concertos and symphonies. Today, they are remembered for their soundtracks, and no one cares about their symphonies. Even Dmitri Shostakovich, I suspect, might one day be remembered more for his film music than his orchestral work. In the rock and roll period, there were already composers who focused their efforts on soundtracks, like Ennio Morricone and John Williams, and actually achieved fame. What I'm saying is, you can actually reach a wider crowd and achieve fame if you combine your music with the mediums of the cyber period, like video games or YouTube videos, or you can be adventurous and venture into the new fields of virtual reality and AI. Either learn about those mediums or form a partnership with someone who understands them. Right now, this is the only way your music can matter. As for you music lovers out there, well, first of all, you can do this. Watch YouTube channels like mine that explore the rich past. We are talking about a century of recorded music, from 1915 to 2015, since the first decade after 2005 still had some good stuff in it, that invites you to dive in. I can assure you this, there is so much in it left to explore, not just for yourself but for historians, that it would take several lifetimes to do. Check out the guys I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and you will find a world of knowledgeable content creators that will introduce you to an endless trove of treasures. In the not-so-distant future, I already fantasize about going to concerts by all the great heroes of the past. I am not talking about the great gig in heaven, but about what will happen when AI reaches the point where it can resurrect Jimi Hendrix, not just sounding like him but also improvising like him. And with the advancements of virtual reality, we can one day have the experience in full. I'm dreaming of the day when I can fully go into the virtual world, take a yellow submarine trip to Pepperland, and attend a live performance by the Beatles. Until then, well, there's a lot more to come on this channel.